So welcome back to the Jewish-Anglican. I'm sure you have heard of the mythological deity from Norse mythology referred to as Loki, the god of trickery, mischief, chaos, etc. He has become especially popular now due to the rise of the MCU, where he is kind of a trickster bad guy on a redemption streak. I'm not sure what you would classify as MCU Loki anymore. But I thought today would be a great day to dive into the linguistic and cultural and even character study of the character of Loki. Because boy, he is odd. First of all, why Loki? Even though he is incredibly important to the myths, there is no recorded sacrifice or any day named after him, which is not super suspicious, but it definitely could raise an eyebrow to the unaware. Let's begin with his name. Loki. What is a Loki? It's a bit of a strange name, and it's had a lot of it actually has a lot of variations throughout the Scandinavian languages, but its Proto-Nordic word or Proto-Germanic is most likely something along the lines of Luke. It translates to binds or knots or locks or anything that is tied. Especially binding is a common one I see. Now this is very fascinating because both in the story Lokasana and Otter's Ransom, Loki constructs a fishing net. Loki is also associated in some passages with a trio of deities, Loki, Odin, and Hoenir, which they're not super common in the myths, but it is a trend that keeps happening. And Loki makes sense since in the Norse myths, they're blood brothers, where they took an oath where they will always treat each other like a brother, and one will not be served without the other. But who is Hoenir? Hoenir and Odin are sometimes viewed as brothers, as actual brothers, not just an oath. Specifically in the creation myth, because there's really two creation myths in Norse mythology. There's the one with Vili and Ve, and the one with Lodr, Odin, and Hoenir. Keep in mind with the name Lodr. In fact, let me read from the Vulspa in the Poetic Edda, translated by Dr. Jackson Crawford. They had no breath, no soul, no hair, no voice. They looked inhuman. Odin gave them breath, Hoenir gave them souls, Loth gave them hair and human faces. Vulspa stanza 18, by the way. First, Loth is just a translation of Lodr, and I want to pinpoint what each god in this passage does. Odin gave them breath, which is something that all humans have, so don't know what the inhuman objects were doing in this context. Just staying there, maybe. And Hoenir then gave them souls. Okay, makes sense, I suppose. Then Lodr gave them human faces and hues and hair and such, which is odd to say the least. Which implies either two things: either humans have already existed, or the gods just look like humans, I guess. Either way, it is an interesting development. Now, this does bring into a very interesting theory. Remember earlier when I mentioned Loki, Hoenir, and Odin are a trio of gods in some stories like Otter's Ransom? Well, there is a theory that Loki and Lodr are most likely one and the same due to similar sounding names, and they're in a trio along with Hoenir and Odin. I know, not the strongest evidence, but it is a fairly popular theory by scholars. So I do think there's probably some form of merit to it. The specific scholars are Jan de Vries and Georges Dumézil have also identified Lodr as being one and the same with Loki. If Loki and Lodr are the same, then maybe that's why Lodr gave humans their look. Since Loki is a shapeshifter, perhaps that stems from Lodr being a shapeshifter, the look of humans. He gave that changing ability to them to make them seem normal. I don't know, just a theory. Now we gotta talk about Lodr's etymology. Now, Lodr's etymology is odd, to say the least. We don't really know. Perhaps it's Lod, which means fruit or people. I've also heard land. In some forms of Old Gothic, it meant shape, which could make sense since if he is a shapeshifter, he gave shape to people. Another one, which is actually connected to the modern German word Lordan, means to blaze. Keep in mind with the to blaze part. A lot of these have a lot of strong theories and reasons as why they're connected to Lodr, another deity. The Celtic god Lu. Or Lu, yes. It has a lot of names, trust me. We will mostly use Lu here. Now, Lu is the Celtic god of the arts, intelligence, truth, oaths, and kingship. his son is Cuchulainn, who is a incarnation of Lu, which I don't know if that's part of the original Celtic mythology or was just a Christian. It's a little unclear of what this is supposed to mean and be, or some old forgotten Celtic thing, but that's kind of besides the point. But you might be asking, what does Lu have to do with Loki? Etymology-wise, it might have to do with him. Specifically, their names do have some similarities, because Lu's name also has a lot of debate among scholars. His name might mean binded by oath, which might sound familiar because Loki's name means bind. So you have two deities with similar sounding names and both meaning bind in some capacity. This could be a possible explanation for different, maybe they share a common deity ancestor per se. Loki also took an oath because, as in the poetic mentions, he took an oath with Odin. So you do have both a bound connection and an oath connection between the two. Is this loose? Maybe. Now, some scholars during the Victorian era thought Lu was connected to Lugos, which is a very, very old Proto-Celtic deity that might or might not have actually been worshipped, whose name is to shine. Again, we have another light-based source. With Loki, we had Lodr, which means to blaze, possibly. And with Lu, we have a connection of Lugos, who might mean to shine. So this is important to factor in. And plus, Lu was synchronized with a Roman deity that had attributes of light, and that is Mercury. For some reasons, the Romans thought Lu of Mercury, mostly due to the arts, but having it be connected to sunlight as well. We don't know about the whole sunlight thing. That was my bad. I just did some extra research, and it's a lot more debated. Anyways, back to the regular programming. But what is interesting about Mercury is that he was also syncretized with Odin, which could possibly connect him back to Loki, because Loki is also very much associated with Odin due to trickery and blood brother stuff. So we have two gods here, Loki and Lu, who might or might not be connected to another deity's name, which is linguistically connected to some type of light source. This is interesting. We do have a Proto-Indo-European Lu, which is Luke, not to be confused with Luke, but Luke, two different names, which means to shine. So we do have some type of shining-based word. We don't know if that was an actual worship deity in Proto-Indo-European or what it was, but we do now have some linguistic connection. Now, I'm not the first to discover this. I think I might be the first to discover the coincidence between both Loki and Lu and their other names that might be having to do with light and fire. That's interesting, but I'm not the first person to point out Loki and Lu's connection. Now, I do want to dive a bit into the Loki character because I find him fascinating, and I think maybe this could reveal something to us. We will be dealing with the Poetic Edda translated by Dr. Jackson Crawford. Loki's first mentioned is actually mentioned in the Völuspá, as where a witch is given a tale to Odin about the end of the world and all this stuff, and let me actually read this out. I saw a prisoner lying in a certain wood, the liar himself, none other than Loki. There sits Sigyn, his wife, although she finds no glee in her husband. Have you learned enough yet, Allfather? Now, this is a prophecy. Mind you, the timeline of the Poetic Edda is really weird. Not everything is in, timeline order. I think it's just, when these were written down order, per se. So, things are messy. But I want to pinpoint the Cern wood part, because that will come into a little bit later. Because in Lokasana, which is a story written later, it talks about him laying on a rock, not on a wood, which could be a change, but I find that a little weird, and I will get into my theories later on. I really want to talk about Lokasana, because Lokasana is really fun, in some ways. It's basically where Loki just gets drunk and roasts all the gods. It is hilarious. Would recommend reading it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just bits and parts, but we'll recap it, so go ahead if you want to read it. Famously, the story tells how Loki has to be served alongside with Odin in every time they're offered a drink together, which very much explains their blood brother connection. And this is a pretty fun story. Thor doesn't show up until later and calls Loki a sissy. Don't know why. But the first god he calls out is Bragi, for some reason. I don't know why he hates Bragi. I tried to research into this, couldn't find anything. He says they're he says the Aesir are all holy and good except for Bragi, but I think he's being sarcastic depending on the later words you see him speak. Also looked into the etymology to see perhaps there's a clue of Bragi, and all I could find was that he's name means noblest and wisdom. Another one is firstborn, which is interesting. So Loki says to Bragi, "You are a coward and have no horse." Don't know about the horse thing. And Bragi replies with, "Well, actually, gotta get the hat on. We're talking about Norse mythology, so I gotta wear a hat." Bragi says, "If we were outside, I'd come back with your severed head." Anyways, the two continue to bicker until Idun begs her husband to stop fighting, and then Loki starts to roast Idun. In fact, Loki starts to open his Daffy Duck mouth and roast her, saying, "Silence, Idun. I don't think there's any woman more lustful than you, not since you wrapped your pretty arms around the killer of your brother." I tried to dig into this, and there is no record of her having sex with the murder of her brother. I could not find anything about that, but interesting part of Norse mythology there. And what's interesting is Idun doesn't really deny or confirm this claim. She just kind of goes along with it, per se. It's really weird how it is written, but I think that's just old Norse poetry for you. Then Loki roasts Gefjon about opening her thighs to a boy. So we might be dealing with PDF files amongst the Aesir. Someone called Chris Hansen or Schlepp. Odin intervenes, and Loki very much says, "Well, you just pick battles for the people you want," which Odin admits, yeah, he does that, and that's terrible, but he likes to do that because it gains him an advantage for Ragnarok. Then Odin calls Loki a perv. Yeah, because apparently Loki was amongst Midgard for 8 years as a woman and different animals, which is a wild statement. But then Loki replies the same thing. Odin has done no different, and he calls that a very perverted way of life. Then Loki roasts Odin's wife Frigg, and then we eventually get to Freya, who Frigg and Freya might or might not be the same deity. Would recommend Dr. Jackson Crawford's video on it. Loki says to Freya, "Silence, Freya. You're not free from faults. I know you too well. You've played the whore with every god and every elf who sits in this hall." And right before I get into Freya's reply, every god up until Odin and Freya, they don't really confirm or deny the accusation. They just don't go along with it. It's so weird. And Odin and Freya are the only ones that actually confirm or deny these actions. Freya very much denies, while Odin definitely confirms. Freya, in fact, says, "You speak lies." No one else has said this yet. Both Loki and Odin have confessed to their horrible sin, but no one else has. And only Freya has rebuked him. It could be something deeper, but like I said before, we're going to get to that soon. Also, Loki claims Freya slept with her brother Freyr. Couldn't find a source outside of this, so we don't know if Loki's making this up or an actual thing. Still important to note. Also, why is Loki specifically calling out witchcraft? That's something of note. Like I said before, get into my theories soon. Also, this is really funny, but Loki calls out Njord and calls his mouth a urinal of piss. Don't know why, but I love that line. Then the god of war/justice, Tyr, steps in and says, "You're going too far, Loki." And Loki says, "Like what you and the rest of the Aesir did to my son." And then Tyr's like, "Hey, I also got punished by it because he lost his hand." And then Loki claims he took Tyr's wife and had a son with her. Never heard of this claim either. And, of course, the Brothers Grimm, who are very important in linguists and mythology and folklore, have come up with a couple explanations for this, so would recommend checking that out as well. Then Loki moves on to Heimdall, and he says, "Silence. In the old days, a miserable fate was assigned to you. You have to stand all the time, stay watchful all the time, as the guardians of the gods." And you could read this as either insult or sympathy. I think it could go both ways. I do think there's a little bit of a sympathetic tone to it. And then, of course, we have Skadi, who says, "We will bind you to a rock soon," which does go into the contradiction of the piece of wood from earlier, but again, we'll get into that soon. Then Thor enters, as Loki begins to insult Thor's wife, and Thor's like, "What are you doing, sissy?" and tries to kill him. Real fun. Loki does turn into a salmon, which is strangely common in Celtic mythology, escapes into the river, they find a net and catch him, which is ironic since he is the inventor of nets. And then they tie him to a rock with a snake hanging over him, dripping venom into his face, unless his wife has a bowl under it. Now, this is also where earthquakes come from, apparently, in Norse mythology, so that's also important to note. I want to point out something about this story since we're into it. Loki in this story is pretty bad, and some of his jokes are ill-advised, but he does have a point in calling out a lot of the sins of the Aesir. They're not really that good of people either, so him calling them out is somewhat satisfying. The only person who doesn't try to hide their sins, besides Loki, is probably Odin. They both fully admit that they are sinful, terrible people. And Freya just denies Loki's claims, obviously. Also, and because of Loki very much calling them out and insulting them, they want to kill him, either tying him to a wood, like the Volspa mentions, or in a rock, as most stories mention. Which does come into a theory, and it isn't my theory. Overly Sarcastic Productions has talked about this. You could possibly see Loki as a Christian figure. That is a little absurd, but I understand. Red from Overly Sarcastic Productions did mention it, and mostly due to the scapegoat idea, that the Aesir just kind of treat Loki like a scapegoat, which is weird, and maybe that could have been an influence on Snorri. As much as I love the theory, there's not a whole lot of evidence. But I would recommend Overly Sarcastic Productions' deep dive on Loki as well. That's a very good one. Could elements of Norse mythology be influenced by Christians? Of course it can. Is Loki one of them? Maybe. Very loose. While I like the idea people love Loki now, and having him be a secret Christian figure is just awesome, I don't think that's the case. As cool as it would be for Loki to be a secret Christian element, I don't think that's the case. But nice theory, I guess, to Overly Sarcastic Productions. The next myth right after this is Thrimskavir. Thrimskavitha? The Theft of Mjolnir. That's just what it is. It's a story of a Jotun, or a giant, or an anti-god, as Dr. Jackson Crawford has theorized as a better alternative could be. Steals Thor's hammer somehow, because he's just that strong. In the morning, Thor awakes to find his hammer missing, and then goes out and tries to see if Loki knows where. Loki does not, so they go to Freya together, and Freya says something very interesting, which goes in stark contrast to the previous story, since the Theft of Mjolnir takes place before Lokasana for some reason, but it's written, but in the reading order it's after. It's weird. Anyways, Freya then says, "I would give it to you even if it were made of gold. I would loan it to you even if it were made of silver." First, this makes Freya sound a lot more lovey-dovey towards Loki than the previous story where she hated him. So that's just really weird, that how just jarringly different it is, but could also show that perhaps Freya was a little more liking towards Loki than she is in the other myths. Interesting to note. It's almost as if Freya is pining after Loki, which is #relatable? Loki then uses the feather cloak to find Thrymr, who is the Jotun king who stole the hammer and demands Freya in marriage. Which, yeah, that isn't good. So Loki returns back to Asgard, tells Thor and Freya that we can get the hammer back. We just need Freya to get married to him. And Freya is absolutely not happy, not going with this, and nearly breaks her necklace when she hears this. So they call the Council of the Gods to determine, what do we do here? And Loki, through his cleverness, realizes, we make Thor the bride. Everybody's like, ooh, yes, good job. So we have Thor pretend to be a bride, and Loki as his bridesmaid to go out to Jotunheim. This is a wild story. In this, we see Loki is more of a fixer and trying to come up with some wild idea to fix their problems. He isn't really a trickster by the ordinary sense. He uses his trickery to help the gods in some way or another. And it does work. Thor and Loki get the hammer back through just tricking the Jotun king. And then another story with Thor and Loki. They have a lot of stories together, interestingly enough. Loki and Thor and two random children, long story, go into Utgard Loki, who has no relation to Loki. Loki is either a title or just a very common name. And in this, we see a much more malevolent form of a Loki, per se, who is far more powerful than Asgard Loki. In this story, we actually see Loki entering an eating competition because he's a great eater. Weird, unorthodox display of hubris, but very well. And he gets into an eating competition with Loki, who is a fire-based spirit. Yes, so there's Loki and Logi. Don't know if Logi is connected to Lugh or Lugus at all. I haven't found any linguistics based off of that, but still, weird thing, and his name means wildfire, so perhaps Loki means tame to fire or just to blazed. Weird stuff. Again, I don't know what is happening here. Another theory is that perhaps Loki is actually a house spirit. In Nordic culture, and along with other cultures, there's this idea of a house spirit who protects your house. But there's one little thing. Don't piss him off or he'll treat you unwell. So perhaps Loki's kind of the house spirit for the gods. He does things for them, he helps them out, but once you piss him off, he's gonna stab you in the back. This could maybe work, especially since he has a lot of children, so he's kind of a household kind of guy, but this is a loose theory, but there might be some type of connection here. Ultimately, with his myths and etymologies, we can pinpoint a few things. He's probably not a Christian martyr or a Christian figure like overly sarcastic productions tried to say he was, or even theorized, as much as I really like the theory and have definitely stolen it from my fiction writing. It's probably not the case. I would love it to be the case, but it's not the case. The idea of like a pagan god being a secret Christian trying to actually do Christian things is kind of a cool story idea. Have stolen it, but it's probably not the case. Some elements, especially the wood versus stone, is he tied to a wood? Is he tied to a stone? I don't think Loki is a Satan figure either, as some people kind of try to paint him as, but he's definitely not a anti-hero, charming, fast-talking, Dr. Light, TM knockoff that the MCU has. That's not an insult to the MCU. I actually really like that version of Loki, and I really enjoy it. He's just a trickster. A helpful trickster, but a trickster overall. I do think with his etymology and myths, we might be able to reconstruct some type of proto-Loki. So here's my reconstruction theory thing. Let's go. Loki/Lodr is a descent from the Proto-Indo-European word Luk, meaning to shine. Loki was one of the trio gods of the creation story we see in the Voluspa, where he, Odin, and Hoenir give life to humans. He gives the human manner and the shape of humans so they can actually be human, per se. And once the world was created, they went out into the great wide world, as seen. These tricks and magics also might have to do with art, possibly, especially since he gives humans their hues. Perhaps that's something to do with the arts and connecting back to Lugh. In short, Loki was probably a high-worshipped god along with Odin, Hoenir at one point, maybe not with the same name, probably called Lodr, and had to do with shining and arts and giving humans their hue, and a possible, and most likely connected to Lugh, and maybe even Prometheus? Like, this is just a theory. A myth theory, and good night. Sorry, I had to do the Matt Pat. Overall, why did I write a couple thousand-word essay on the character and linguistics of Loki? Well, I am biased. I am very fascinated with Norse mythology, and my great-grandfather came directly from Scandinavia as 100% Swedish-born. So I'm fascinated with Scandinavia and a lot of other things. You might not have guessed it from all my Anglo stuff, but I am also very Scandinavian. MCU Loki. Come on. MCU Loki is one of the greatest written characters in the MCU. I also have written a version of Loki that is based off the myths for, many years now. I even have one where he travels back in time and meets Christ. That's a wild sense out of context, but one day you guys read it or watch it and absolutely love it. Or maybe even listen to it. I really should. Would you guys be in favor of doing like an audio drama? Like be listening to an audio drama of some of my stories? That'd be really cool. Anyways, that's besides the point. Is that I find Loki a very fascinating linguistic and character in myths and stories. Which myths and stories are pretty much one and the same if you ask Tolkien and Lewis and that one socialist from the 1800s, Sorel. A myth is a story, and a story is a myth. A myth does not mean it's not true. A myth means it is powerful. And that's what makes Christianity so great. It is one of the true myths of the world. He is not a hero. He's not a villain. He's most likely not a Christian martyr. But he is a Loki. A trickster that can do good. A trickster that can do bad. But should always strive to be good. A trickster who should strive to do right. And to use their abilities to do what is just. And plus, it's fun doing research about linguistics, and maybe it's just me, but when I do linguistics and really studying languages and history, it always gives me ideas for writing. Don't know if that's just me, but hopefully that helps any creatives out there. Maybe this helps you. I hope you enjoy, and God bless.